both Russia and Iran are responsible for proxy attacks in the United Kingdom and across Europe.
That was Chris quizzing the Prime Minister Keir Starmer at the G7 summit in Evian, and this was after the incident involving a Russian vessel and a UK-based yacht off the British coast on Tuesday, and the fact that two men had been found guilty of conspiracy to commit arson at the Prime Minister's former home and on his former car, which the BBC then proved had links to Russia. And if that wasn't enough, he's got a big political battle shaping up in his own party as we approach polling day in the Makerfield by-election. All that to be discussed on the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, Chris, I don't know exactly where you are.
To be honest, Adam, neither do I, but I can paint a picture. I am currently travelling backwards. I'm on a minibus. In fact, most of the people on this minibus are currently asleep because as we record at lunchtime on Wednesday, we've been up since about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, your time, because we were doing the round of interviews with the Prime Minister that the broadcast political editors do, or tend to do, on these foreign trips. We're at the G7 in eastern France, and we're currently making our way down the motorway, and we'll be at the airport in about half an hour or so, I think. But yeah, I've picked a seat that's going backwards.
Chris, some beautiful logistics, travel, journalism happening there, and plenty of political journalism coming from you in a second as well. Alex is here too. Where are you, Alex?
Hello, I am in the Makerfield constituency where obviously people might have noticed there's a bit of a by-election taking place. So I've been pounding the good streets of Makerfield to get a sense of it all. Except
Makerfield, as we know, isn't a specific place. It's lots of places.
It's like a collection of towns kind of just south of Wigan. So yeah, Makerfield is the constituency, but the place is made up of places like Hindley and Ashton in Makerfield. So it's like a collection of towns and all the bits in between rather than actually a place. Like people don't say I'm from Makerfield. They say I'm from Ashton in Makerfield or whatever else it might be.
Okay, lots to talk about then, Chris, because you did your interview with Keir Starmer early this morning. It made the Today programme, so I could listen to it over breakfast. And yeah, you were combining a lot of things, just the potential of what happens after the Makerfield by-election on Thursday and like the very real global security picture right now. Where do you want to start?
So I guess the global security picture has clearly dominated the last couple of days here, as you should expect at the G7, not least the conversation about the Middle East and Donald Trump's deal with Iran, and then Ukraine, because President Zelensky of Ukraine has been here talking to leaders, the part emphasising that he felt there was a real unity around the G7 table on Ukraine, which sounded like a subtext, tacit acknowledgement that, you know, Donald Trump has blown hot and cold on his interest in the Ukraine conflict and his support indeed for Kyiv. I think the other thing then, Adam, there's sort of overlap between the conversation here and the one back home is the whole question of defence spending, given that that clearly sits alongside any discussion around global security. And we saw that the Chief of Defence Staff, didn't we, yesterday, setting out his concerns about the current funding plan, the funding plan that led to the now former Defence Secretary John Healey resigning last week. And then, of course, there is just the spectacularly large elephant in the room, which is the whole leadership question. And that speech from Wes Streeting, the former Health Secretary, yesterday, the interview they gave to Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight, and then the Prime Minister in the interview that I did, and he said similar things in the other interviews, trying to respond to that in the best way that he can, really, given the circumstances he's in.
And Alex, we didn't do this on the previous episode of Newscast because we were having that big extended conversation with Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary. But actually, while we were recording that conversation on Tuesday afternoon, Sir Richard Knighton, the Chief of the Defence Staff, was giving evidence to this House of Lords committee, and he was being questioned by Lord Robertson, who wrote the Defence Review, which was this kind of the basis for the big political arguments about how much to spend on defence of the last few weeks. And actually, he was saying that... And it was kind of news to me because he was saying that the issue is about how much there is to spend on defence now and the kind of the bills of the MOD and the military. It wasn't just about getting the military ready for future wars. It seems like it's the financial pressures on the MOD are even more pressing.
Yeah, and I mean, this has become such a part of the conversation, hasn't it, over the course of the last few days since the resignation of John Healey as Defence Secretary in particular. And there's been so much focus, you rightly say, Adam, on the Defence Investment Plan, you know, this idea about how the government's going to come up with the money for future defence spending to match what they call the Strategic Defence Review, which was this big overlook at what the government might need, what the country might need for its defence in future. But you're right. I mean, this is an indication there's already pressure on budgets, which feeds into the big arguments about what the government's priorities are, what the government chooses to spend on, and the trade-offs that it then has to acknowledge publicly that it faces as a consequence of all of that. And just to, not that everything comes back to the kind of elephant in the room of leadership, but that is sitting behind all of these conversations right now. You know, the choices that are going to face whoever is leading the government in the next few days and weeks. And it's interesting that, you know, you heard Keir Starmer when he was talking to Chris last week making that sort of argument that, you know, whatever happens in the next few days and weeks, there are going to be choices that have to be made from whoever finds themselves in that seat in number 10.
And Chris, the other thing that was then happening on Wednesday simultaneously with all of this was the emergence of this news about this incident with the UK-based yacht with a British couple who were crewing it, receiving warning shots from a Russian vessel off the British coast.
Yes, we have a Russia which is aggressive. We're in the 5th year of the conflict in Ukraine. We were discussing that here at the G7. And we know that both Russia and Iran are responsible for proxy attacks in the United Kingdom and across Europe. And we have to be alert to that. We are dealing with that every single day. They take different forms. But that is the Russia that we are dealing with. That's why it's so important that an event like this here in France, the G7, where world leaders get together, we discuss the ways in which we address the Iran conflict, the Ukraine conflict, and also what we can do together for the resilience of all of our countries.
Chris, yeah, just give me your take on what the Prime Minister was saying there, just why you wanted to phrase that question in that way.
Well, I was very struck yesterday as news of this incident in the Channel began to emerge at how quickly those in government that were traveling with on this trip were willing to engage it and said that they would respond to it. And we heard then shortly afterwards publicly from the Ministry of Defence, and there was some guidance offered as well for various folk in government. Right, and of course the context was the conversation here at the G7 about Russia, about the threat that Russia poses to Europe in particular, but to, if you like, Western democracy more broadly. Now, the government's made the case, you heard it from the Prime Minister, that they think this was an isolated incident. The second the word Russian featured in the conversation relating to this warship, and then the discharge of a gun, you know, the firing of a gun, it sits into that wider context. And I thought I wanted to ask the Prime Minister about it because I detected, having seen that response yesterday, that he would be up for saying something. And you heard there that he was talking about it as reckless. And the Prime Minister, you know, picks this Prime Minister in particular, but Prime Ministers in general, but this one in particular, pick their words very, very carefully. It clearly did. He was going to use that word in advance. He said it to someone else. I think it was to Chris Hope of GB News in his interview as well. So I thought it sat in the context of what's happening here, and then also that story Daniel De Simone, our colleague, brought us the other day on the BBC, that the conviction of those two men for arson connected to the Prime Minister's house in North London and a car that he used to own involved Russia. And so just that sense of Russia sitting so prominently in various incidents that can be seen, certainly in collection, if not always individually, as acts of aggression.
And looking at that incident in the Channel, I was just really thinking about something that Jeremy Bowen said to me a few years ago about why international tension and chaos is bad, because it leads to unpredictability, which can then spiral into crisis. And okay, this incident in the Channel hasn't become an international crisis. It was presumably very scary, as we've heard, for the people on board. But it just shows you, if you've got a world where there's aggression and tension between the UK and Russia, and there are Russian vessels in British waters, then of course you're going to get incidents like this, which have the potential to go go very, very badly wrong. And we're just kind of lucky that in this case it didn't. Now, Alex, let's go into the portion of Newscast that is kind of going to be the post-Makerfield by-election section. But the fact is the by-election hasn't happened yet because we're recording this on Wednesday. The polls open on Thursday morning. Just give me your take from the streets of Makerfield, which isn't a specific place, but give me the vibe.
Yeah, the towns of the Makerfield constituency. Yeah, I mean, we've all covered a fair few by-elections and elections in our time, right? But honestly, and I'm trying not to exaggerate this or be too hyperbolic about it all, but this genuinely does feel different because even as soon as you get to the constituency, you start to see all the placards up in the window, and even neighbouring properties might have placards with one house saying, I support Robert Kenyon of Reform UK, and the next house saying, I support Andy Burnham. There's a lot of them across the constituency. As you drive round, there are literally just like teams of campaigners and canvassers out on the streets kind of everywhere. I bumped into a couple who just showed me the leaflets they'd had through their letterbox in the last couple of days, and it was like a fairly thick wad, from all different parties actually. And in the town of Ashley and Makerfield itself, I was there just trying to get a sense of what people feel and think and the issues that they care about. And honestly, there was one point where I was bumping into more journalists than I was local people. I mean, journalists from Poland, just journalists from all over the world. There were a couple of journalists from France on the train when I was on the way to the constituency. So obviously there's a reason there's so much focus on this, is because we know what's at stake. We know that Andy Burnham has said if he wins this by-election contest, then he would enter any leadership contest that was triggered against Keir Starmer. We know there are other parties, including but not exclusively Reform UK, 14 candidates in total fighting this by-election. But what I think I would glean from what I've picked up so far is the sense that almost everybody in this constituency knows what's at stake as well. They know that they are making a decision that's going to clearly have an impact on the constituency. It's going to be their representative and what they do for the towns of Makerfield. But it's also got potential consequences for the country, and there's a real awareness about that.
And Chris, I know you went to the constituency a couple of times. My sort of takeaway, now that we're at the end of the campaign, is it's not ended up being as weird as I thought it might have been. Because at the start, it's like, oh, this is going to be like a primary campaign, almost like a presidential primary in America to pick the next prime minister. But actually, so much of it has felt like actually a classic hard-fought by-election.
Yeah, I think that's right. With an extra dollop of attention. I mean, let's be honest, by-elections always get an extra dollop of attention from folk like us because they're happening in isolation. I say in isolation, there's actually another 2 by-elections aren't there happening tomorrow as well. But clearly, as Alex was saying, this one is on another level because of what is at stake. In the kind of prosecution of the arguments in those towns and villages to the south of Wigan, it is similar to other by-election campaigns. You have candidates who are arguing about the degree to which they are authentically local. You have a lot of arguments around the specific pledges that candidates are making about the constituency itself, how often they're likely to be seen in that constituency or not if they win, etc., etc. But framed through that wider prism, which again to an extent happens at every by-election, but this one in particular, that wider prism of arguably the central political tussle of right now, which is a tussle between the Labour Party and Reform. Of course, there's lots of other tussles in different parts of the UK, depending on where you are geographically. Of course there are, but an absolutely central tussle is between, the incumbent government and the insurgency of the last few years. And in many senses, Makerfield is a kind of petri dish in that wider discussion and debate, with at its heart, Andy Burnham making an argument which will be the argument he carries on with if he wins the by-election. Don't know if you heard the absolutely volcanic sneeze from Robert Peston of ITV.
Yes. Bless you, Robert.
Maybe you didn't. Anyway, but I've completely lost my train of thought now. Oh, yeah, that was it. This is that, if Andam can win, he will use his victory as a springboard to make an argument nationally, particularly to his own party, that he can eat Reform UK in a way that lots of other Labour folk can't, and therefore he should be Prime Minister. That'll be the broad, if slightly, from my perspective, crude simplification of the argument we're likely to hear from him in the coming days, if he wins.
Newscasters everywhere are now trying to club together to either get a packet of tissues for Robert Peston or a box of antihistamines, because he is sneezing away. Thanks for joining in, Robert. Anyway, Alex, I think another intriguing thing about Makerfield, and bearing in mind everything Chris just said there about it being a sort of petri dish for the whole country and the politics that we might be about to get, or the politics that we've already got, it just became about who was the best representative for the area, who was the best local champion. And I suppose that happened because that's Andy Burnham's trump card, because he's local and he didn't want it to be about his ambitions in the future. And actually for Reform, they realised, oh yeah, Andy Burnham's local, so we can't run a campaign that's all about, oh, he's some carpetbagger from down south who's just using this to get to Downing Street. So of course it ended up being a very local contest.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Although Reform did try to make the argument that Andy Burnham was using it as a sort of stepping stone to Westminster, in which case Andy Burnham then responded by pointing out his kind of local links. But it's not just among those candidates. All of the candidates actually have been sort of brandishing their local credentials. And actually, I think I would say it has become a bit of a theme of by-elections that people do want candidates in by-elections, broader than this one, to focus on what matters to them in the area and not to just have the sense that somebody's either been parachuted in or was just, going to be in the constituency for 5 minutes and disappear off somewhere else. That seems to be a theme that comes across in many by-elections, actually. And perhaps part of that is because by-elections do, as Chris said, attract more attention because they often happen on their own, or in this case as one of three. And I think there can sometimes be this sense, and you definitely pick this up in this constituency, of, OK, we're getting all of this attention at the moment. The media are turning up and all the parties are sending their ground troops and people are campaigning and there's all of this kind of focus on our area. But what we don't want is that then to all just disappear off over the horizon when the by-election's over. We want to kind of retain some of this attention so we can see the issues that matter to us, whatever they might be, addressed. And I think that's been amplified in this by-election. So all of the candidates, not just Andy Burnham and Robert Kenyon, are really kind of like saying why they think they are the local person who would best address the local issues, whether it's cost of living or the high street or wherever else it might be. There is another sort of interesting element in this by-election that's worth a mention, and it's how well or not Restore Britain do. So the party that's set up by Rupert Lowe, who was the former Reform MP. I've seen placards and posters from that party here, and that's going to be interesting because obviously what their performance may speak to is what's happening on the right of British politics. So it's sort of another element in what is already a pretty fascinating by-election contest.
And Chris, it was notable that in the portion of your interview with Keir Starmer where you were asking him about this, he was sort of trying to get out in front of it. So let's have a listen to that bit of the conversation.
If Andy Burnham wins, and I hope he does, and that's why I've told our activists and members to all go and support him, so I hope he wins, but we then tip straight into the Manchester mayoralty by-election because that's under a timeline, starts pretty well immediately. So we're all going to have to focus on that. But it is important for me to step back from this. I was elected to serve my country. I came into politics late in life for one reason and one reason only, which is to change the lives of millions of people who want and are entitled to a better life.
And I the structures in place to ensure that you can, or try to ensure.
Yes, I've been very clear. I don't think there should be a challenge because I think that is a bad thing for the country. If there is a challenge, I intend to fight in any challenge to my leadership. Of course I do.
So yeah, what did you make of what Keir Starmer was saying? He was sort of almost like he was talking to us from the future.
Yeah, and it's intriguing because, as I say, Prime Ministers generally, and I think this one in particular, pick their words very carefully when they are asked questions about how they may behave at a still hypothetical, if actually quite realistic and imminent moment in the future, for fear that they say something that weakens them. So you can understand rationally from their perspective why they might be careful. But as various scenarios loom ever larger, then Prime Ministers and their teams will start wargaming what they think might be strategically useful to say out loud. And the Prime Minister came into his round of interviews this morning having decided that he was going to say that, if Andy Burnham does win the by-election in Makerfield, then hang on a minute, surely the real imminent priority for the Labour Party, and therefore for him, should be the other vacancy that he would be creating, because you cannot be an MP and the Mayor of Greater Manchester at the same time. So if he wins the by-election, he will have to relinquish the role as Mayor, and therefore there'll be a by-election for the Greater Manchester Mayor, which could be keenly competitive with Reform and the Greens and plenty of others giving it a fair old go. And it's a it's a prized jewel, if you like, in the devolved crown of Labour's current mix of elected offices. So they would obviously want to keep it. And the Prime Minister's argument is, well, look, effectively, Andy Burnham, you caused this first by-election, and if you win it, you're going to cause another one. So in order for Labour to stand still numerically, Labour need to hold that by-election. So why not focus on that? It is telling that Team Burnham have said that they regard it as absolutely ludicrous that you would postpone any kind of question around the leadership until after that mayoral race. Not least, they whisper, it would be much harder, in their view, for Labour to win that mayoral by-election if it comes to pass, with Keir Starmer still as Prime Minister, than in a situation where either he has been replaced or there is a process to replace him.
And Chris, I'm going to let you carry on your bus journey because I think your signal is getting a little bit dodgy. So safe travels and see you when you land back on British shores very soon. Goodbye. Right, Alex, in terms of the other kind of plot lines converging around the Makerfield result, Wes Streeting, the former health secretary, he did a big speech on Tuesday talking about his view of the economy. He's calling his approach progressive capitalism. And then Chris was alluding to this earlier on in the episode. He sat down with Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight and basically said, yeah, I'm ready to pull the trigger on this leadership contest that people have been waiting for weeks.
Yeah, and conversely, while you've got the Prime Minister telling Chris that he thinks that there needs to be a pause in whatever might happen post-Makerfield because of the potential of the Greater Manchester mayoral by-election, Wes Streeting is making the polar opposite argument, effectively, because he was telling Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight that he thinks what he called the sort of paralysis when all of these questions about future Labour leadership are swirling can't go on. So what he was effectively saying was that he would be prepared to trigger a leadership contest. He said he thinks the Prime Minister should take the weekend to have a think about things and his preference, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was saying that his preference was that the Prime Minister had a think in the eventuality that Andy Burnham wins the Makerfield by-election, and then effectively he was making the case he thinks that Keir Starmer should sort of concede and maybe step aside, and then there could be a contest or whatever else, set a timetable, that kind of thing. But we've heard from Keir Starmer that all of the indications so far are that he's not really prepared to do that. So then Wes Streeting was saying in that eventuality he'd be prepared to trigger a leadership contest, and he was suggesting that he had the names, that magic number of 81 Labour MPs that he would need the backing of in order to do that. He was saying that he had them already. So I think, it's hard to really know what the choreography of the next few days might be. But I think if Andy Burnham wins the Makerfield by-election contest, then there is the potential, and Wes Streeting was certainly signalling this, that things could move quite quickly and we could end up in a Labour leadership contest fairly soon after that Makerfield result comes in.
Part of me just thinks, what has recent history told us about Keir Starmer and the Cabinet? It's told us that Keir Starmer wants to stay, and he wants to stick to the rule book, and the rule book says that he automatically gets to compete in a leadership contest. So, yeah. Then actually the Cabinet have already had opportunities to go and tell him that he should set out a timetable for his departure. I wonder, are there other Cabinet members who didn't do that last time who would be willing to do it this time? Or will it just be the same members of the Cabinet making the same argument to him just a couple of weeks or about a month or so later? And yeah, I mean, I'm wonder if it's going to be that different this time round, or does a potential by-election victory by Andy Burnham just completely change all those calculations? And actually, I'm just sounding quite naive about what the next few days might be like.
No, honestly, I think part of it is that we don't actually know what the next few days are going to be like. We can speculate till the ends of the earth, and of course we all love doing that, but we don't actually know, because you're right. With these things, quite a lot of it can come down to mood and momentum, two of which are quite important factors in politics. So I think, the result of the Makerfield by-election could set the mood one way or another. And then I think that people who've got their eyes on that top job are going to want to capitalise on any momentum, which is why things might move quite quickly. But I certainly think over the course of the weekend, the Cabinet will be key, because, as we say, Keir Starmer's giving the message again and again and again. And of course, he would say this, wouldn't he, until he doesn't. But his message is very clearly that he is going nowhere, that, he wants to keep his job, and he sets out the reasons why he thinks he should. But obviously, you do need the support of your top team and the bulk of your parliamentary party in order to do that. And that is where the mood bit of this equation might really come into play post-Makerfield, depending on the result.
And Alex, as we come to the end of this episode of Newscast, shall we revisit our successful spin-off format by-election cast, and would you like to give us one last mini episode of by-election cast from the streets of Makerfield, as discussed, not in an individual place in itself?
Yeah, quite. From the towns that make up the
Makerfield
constituency. We'll just keep saying it until we go blue in the face. Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, look, we've already touched upon it, but it does feel like a really consequential by-election, and clearly there's lots of focus on Andy Burnham and how he does in this election. There's lots of focus on reform, and you have to bear in mind that Reform and their candidate Robert Kenyon, well, they are pushing hard here, and Reform did well in the set of local elections that happened in May, but they are not the only two candidates, despite all the attention and understandable attention that there has been on them. They are not the only two candidates standing in this by-election. There's that really interesting factor of Rupert Lowe's party, Restore Britain, and their candidate Rebecca Shepherd, and how they perform in this by-election, what that says about where the arguments might shape up on the right of British politics. And then the list of the 14 other candidates, it is long, but, I have caught up with some of those over the course of the last couple of days. So, and again, it comes down a lot for them about the battle of sort of localism, if you like. So Sarah Wakefield from the Green Party, she's been talking a lot about wanting to bring, in her words, joy to politics and kind of positive solutions that she thinks there can be to voters that live in this constituency. You've got Michael Winstanley from the Conservatives. He's a former mayor of Wigan, again, talking about his local links, positioning himself as a bit of a community champion. Jake Austin is standing for the Liberal Democrats. Their real focus has been on the cost of living. That's definitely something that's come up as I've been speaking to voters here. So they're talking about the plans that they have to try and tackle energy bills, for example. So it's there has been a sort of narrow focus on the perceived front runners. It is a long list, and it is being hard fought. I tell you, you just need to be out on the streets of this constituency and you get a sense of it straight away. And what is totally fascinating is that while there are some people who live here who are like, oh my goodness, please don't put another camera in my face, I just don't want to talk to any more media, I'm sick of all the journalists, quite understandably, I think it's fair to say. There are others who see this as a kind of a moment when the focus is shifted to the place they live, and a place that some of them feel has been overlooked or forgotten for a bit too long. And I think what the hope for many voters in this constituency is, whatever happens after this by-election, that focus doesn't just disappear entirely, and that some of the, or one of the consequences of all of this attention might be that some of the things they really care about get looked at.
I'll just always remember watching that Question Time special from the constituency and ending up zooming in on a map of some waste grounds next to the Sainsbury's, because there was an argument about building houses there. I was like, yep, this by-election is just as local as it is national. Alex, before you go...
Absolutely right.
Before you go, and I know you've got millions of hours of work to do, yesterday we were chatting to Bridget Phillips, in the Education Secretary, and she was saying when the social media ban comes in, children are just going to have to get used to a very retro thing, which is being bored. What did you do as a child when you were bored, and how did you enjoy being bored?
I saw your interview with her, and I thought that was totally fascinating, that kind of notion about being bored. I mean, I guess maybe there's an argument that says it's about resilience and learning to entertain yourself. But yeah, I tell you, I almost don't want to tell you because it's going to make me sound like more of a nerd than people might already think I am.
Please.
But I genuinely was an avid reader. So I did used to read a lot of books, but I also did that other thing, which maybe other people with sisters might find familiar, which is make-up dances. And I'm just really glad that there weren't camera phones around when I was a kid, because I hate the thought that some of the terrible dances to me and my sister made up to pop songs and then forced our family to sit and watch were never recorded on camera so that they could be rolled out at this stage in my life. Thank goodness for it.
Yeah, whenever I was bored, I would just, write a play or try and put on a show and dragoon everyone into that. So I think we were if we'd lived next door to each other, we'd probably be in showbiz now.
We could have done it together.
Yes, we'd be on the stage now rather than in the news studio.
It all could have been so different.
So Alex, you're going to stay up all night on Thursday night doing the result of Makerfield, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a special programme looking at, because it isn't just Makerfield, there's two other Scottish by-elections taking place as well, in Aberdeen South and Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, and both of those are important by-elections too. So we're going to do an overnight special with Laura Kunsberg and taking in all of the results and getting all of the reaction through the night on Thursday.
And we're going to do a live streamed episode of Newscast, as is tradition, at 7 a.m. on Friday morning. So if you're still awake and still standing and still have a voice, you're very welcome to come and join us.
Yeah, I would endeavour to pop in. It would be lovely to see you. I only insist that you have a cup of tea.
Endeavour, that's not yes.
That was a caveated yes.
Yes, we've been around two politicians for too long. Right, Alex, hopefully speak to you on Friday morning.
Lovely. See you then.
Bye-bye. And as is usual at this point in the podcast, I will say that there is a full list of Makerfield candidates on the BBC News website.